All right. Welcome, everybody, to Management 222. This is week 3 on real estate principles. Welcome, Andrea and Catherine. If you have any questions tonight, just go ahead and type them in. Hopefully, we'll have some interaction as far as tonight's topic. Tonight, we're going to be talking about mortgages and notes and the actual financing and how that financing usually occurs. Last week, we talked about deeds and about ownership transfer. And week 1, we talked about just the basics of real estate and also title. We talked a little bit about titling and ownership and different ownership types. And so hopefully you see kind of a progression that makes logical sense about how this course is designed. You know, we started with the basics of real estate, then we talked about how you can own real estate in different ways and different ownership types. Then last week we focused on transfer, as far as how you transfer ownership of property. And then this week we're going to be focused on financing of property. And Catherine and Andrea, I don't know if either of you are trust fund babies or are just independently wealthy. Most of us, though, 99% of us out there, when we go to purchase a home, we're going to have to borrow some money to do so, right? So, like I say, I'm not assuming that you would have to borrow money, but most people, and I'm including myself, when I've bought homes in the past, I've had to finance those homes. And so the way that we get money to buy a home, right, is we go to a bank or a mortgage broker, and that banker or mortgage broker is able to underwrite us, meaning they're able to assess our credit worthiness. That's where your credit score and your work history and your income and your debt to income ratio and all those different things, that's where all those things come into play. And then they assess whether or not they're willing to lend us that money, right, in order for us to buy the house. And as a concept, Andrea and Catherine, how is the bank protected when they give you that money? Think about that for a minute. How does the bank protect themselves? Because this is an investment they're making, right? In you or I, if we're going to borrow money from them, they have to protect their investment. So how do they, as a bank or a brokerage, how do they protect themselves when it comes to a mortgage? And maybe if you can't think of how they would protect themselves, think in terms of when you buy a car and borrow money for a car. How does the bank protect itself when you go and buy a car and borrow money on that car? So the first step is they maintain title, right? So they maintain title as long as we owe money on a car or on our home. And then if we stop making payments, what do? So Andrea or Catherine, what does the bank do if we stop making payments on a car or on our home? And I'm not, this isn't a trick question. This is a very important concept. Catherine, good job. So they repossess, right? They repossess our car if we don't make payments on our car, so they can then sell the car and regain the money that they let us borrow, right? The same is true for homes, and the process is foreclosure, right? So a bank or lending institution will do what's called the foreclosure process, or foreclose on us and take the home back from us if we don't make our payments. And if you think about that, there, especially 5 or 6 years ago, there were a lot of articles in the paper. There were 48 hours, 60 minutes, a lot of news episodes, specials on people losing their homes, right, in that downturn when people were losing their jobs and things. And most of those shows made it, the whole idea was make the bank look like the bad guy, right, and make the individual borrower seem like the victim in that situation. But reality is, let's say Andrea, Catherine, and me, let's say we go into business with each other, and our business is going to be letting people borrow our money, our personal money, in order to buy homes, okay? And the way we're going to make money is off the interest, just like a bank does. But instead of them going to the bank, they're going to borrow money from us, and then they're going to repay us over time, and we're going to make money, right? So Andrea, Catherine, you two and I are going to go into business together, and we're going to have a lending company, and it's going to be CAD Lending, right? CAD Lending, because it's Catherine, Andrea, and Dave. It's the first letter of our first names, and we're going to go into a lending business together. Now, we're all going to bring our personal money, everything, all the savings that we have, and let's just pretend for a minute, Andrea and Catherine, that you have some savings, whether or not you do or don't, whether or not I do or don't, we're going to bring our savings together. And let's say we start our business with $500,000, okay? We're able to scrap together $500,000. And so in our minds, that means that we can let two different people borrow enough money to buy a modest house for $250,000. So we're going to let two different people borrow money for $250,000 each, and they're going to pay us interest over time, and that's how we're going to make money. Let's say we get a year down the road, and Andrea and Catherine, and the business is going great, the payments are coming in, and one of our borrowers, one of our homeowners, calls us and says, okay, I'm sorry to tell you this, but I've lost my job. I've been in the hospital. I don't have enough money to pay my bills, and so I'm not going to be able to make the payments on the home. So what is our response going to be as the lender? If this is our money, right, and we're in the business of making money off interest, we're going to have to pursue a course to protect our investment, right, to protect the money that we let that person borrow. And that course would be taking possession of the house, selling it, and getting our money back, right? And in that process, that will mean that that individual who's in that house is going to have to move, right? They're going to have to, because we're going to sell that house and they have to get out. The whole point of me telling this story, and hopefully it makes sense, Catherine and Andrew, you're not just scratching your head saying, I have no clue what he's talking about. Hopefully it makes some sense. The point of the story is, when we think about banks and especially the evil banks, that were kicking people out of their houses, we need to think in terms of you and I, if we were the ones letting somebody borrow our money, and if you and I were letting someone promise to us that they would repay us and repay us on time, because that's our money, right? We've invested in them, and as soon as they can't fulfill that contract, we've got to have some way of recovering our money. And the way we recover it is to take our house back and take that investment back and to sell it so that we get our money. So that's the idea, and that's the process, and that's the reason that people go into foreclosure or have repossession of cars. And frankly, there's some bad situations where people get kicked out of their homes and get put on the street basically by banks. But reality is, if we're in a situation where we've promised to pay on time and then we don't, and it's their money, not ours, right? It's not our home, it's their home, because they have title on it and they let us borrow money in good faith, assuming that we'd repay that loan, then we've got to do it. And if we don't, then we would assume that they would take that back, right? They'd take the car, they'd take the home, whatever it is that we're not making payments on, they need to take that back so they can sell it and recover their investment. So that's the process in a nutshell. Any questions, Andrea or Catherine, on the process? Just kind of the basic tenets of why repossession and foreclosure occurs, and with the idea that we know that it's a tough situation, right, for a lot of people when that does occur. But reality is, if they're in the business of lending, we're in the business of, if we're a borrower, we're in the business of promising that we'll do something. And when we don't fulfill our promise and make payments, then their only recourse they have is to take that back, the property, whether it's a car or a home or a boat or whatever it is, so that they can recover their money, right? Recover their investment. Okay, so Catherine or Andrea, did either of you know anybody? You don't have to give specifics or anything like that, but did either of you know anybody that lost a home or a car back in the recession back in 2008 or 9, when everybody was struggling and losing jobs and struggling to make payments? You're lucky, Andrea. So you've seen people in other times, Catherine, have that happen to them? It's a really sad situation in most cases. Oh, I'm sorry, your own parents. It's a really sad situation, and sometimes it's really by no fault of the people who it happens to. They get into a situation where, because of a job loss or because of medical bills or medical expenses or because of disability, or because there's just a lot of things that can happen in your life, that can create a situation where it makes it hard to make your payments and put you in a situation where you might lose your assets and lose what you've tried to pay for. So Okay, so now that we've kind of talked through that, that's kind of a foundation for what we're going to be discussing this week in the slides. But I want to take a quick break and visit about something that I think is important to discuss as well. So this week we're going to be talking about um, mortgages and mortgage rates. When it comes to our assignment, we'll be discussing different lending issues when it comes to the discussion board this week. Um, but but let me give you some information that probably will help with this week's assignment, which is to basically it's a situation where we're going to find out the monthly payments and do the calculations, which I need to see your work. Don't just give me the answers. Actually, show me your work on this week's assignment when you turn it in, so that I can give you partial credit if I can. But we're going to be doing a few calculations about payments, mortgage payments, and it's really easy. It's not a hard situation, but I wanted to show you a couple things that I think are helpful. So first of all, can you see the new screen? Who are the top 10 mortgage lenders in America? Okay, so this is something I just want to share with you, because I think this is something that most people it's a situation that's very misunderstood, I guess, and so this is what I want to talk about for just a second about mortgages. So this is somebody's site, right, talking about the top 10 mortgage lenders in America, and something that may surprise you, may not, the top mortgage lender by far, not even a close second, is Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And you'll recognize these names as companies or agencies that used to be, well, they still are. They were indirectly formed and supported by the federal government. They're not considered government entities, but they're, in essence, highly regulated and highly controlled and supported by the federal government. So Fannie and Freddie Mac are by far, so we're talking about a portfolio of over 1.5 trillion, okay? And when you go to the next biggest portfolio, at least back in 2010, it was only 77 billion. So just a silly small amount relative to how big, the market share is from Freddie and Fannie Mae. Now, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae don't sell us mortgages. We can't go directly to them. What happens is our banks, the banks that we borrow money from, end up selling the mortgages to Fannie and Freddie, okay? So they end up buying the mortgages from the banks, so that the banks don't have to sit with those mortgages on their balance sheet, so that they can go lend and do more lending to get those off their balance sheet. So were both of you familiar with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac before tonight? Catherine, Andrea, if you're willing to share. These are two names that you're probably very familiar with if you were watching the financial news back in 2008, 2009. But basically, most of us aren't familiar with those two names because they're not companies that we interact with at all, right? They're not banks that we recognize. They're the companies that buy mortgages from the banks, and they're, like I say, heavily regulated and supported by the federal government. So in 2008, 2009, you and I as taxpayers, all of us as taxpayers here in this country, bailed out Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Both of them were insolvent. They were going belly up, and so that we used tax dollars as a country, like we did with GM and like we did with the banks, and propped these two entities up so that they could stay in existence. Now, the last 5 years, these two entities have done very well financially as things have recovered. So, but just wanted to point that out. You're going to recognize the next ones, right? Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Chase. You might recognize Ally Bank. That was GMAC back in the day. Citi Mortgage, US Bank. These are names that you're probably more familiar with, at least most of them. Where Fannie and Freddie, being the largest by far, many people aren't familiar with them and don't know why that's the case. And it's because the federal government supports and subsidizes them as entities, and also creates a backstop, in essence, a backstop if those entities have problems, where they'll basically bail them out and help those entities out to continue to support home ownership. So it's part of the federal government's mandate, or what they feel like is their mandate, to help more people in this country become homeowners. If Fannie and Freddie didn't exist, we'd have a lot less home ownership in this country, because a lot fewer people would be able to get mortgages. If it was only left to the normal banks like Wells Fargo and Bank of America and Chase, if it was left to only those normal banks to do all the financing for mortgages, we'd have a lot fewer mortgages in this country, and it would be a lot harder to get a house, because it would be a lot harder to get a loan. Now, you might be saying, well, it's really hard anyway, Dave. It's really tough. And I would agree that it's tough to get a loan. But the only reason that so many loans even are available to us at this point through the banks is because of Fannie and Freddie and their willingness, through the government support that they get, to buy those loans from the banks. Okay. Most times when a bank writes a mortgage, okay, when they give a new loan, they're writing it knowing that they're going to immediately turn around and sell it to Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac. And the same is true for mortgage brokers. Those brokers know that they are going to immediately turn around and usually sell it to Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac or a bank to service those loans. Okay? So it's an interesting article. You could read through it at another time, but just wanted to point that out and discuss, because Fannie and Freddie, as far as mortgages are concerned and financing, the topic of tonight's conversation, Fannie and Freddie are more important than any other entities when it comes to facilitating mortgages in this country and supporting home ownership in this country. And it's basically the federal government behind the scenes, that really controls those two entities. Any questions or concerns before we go to another site that I think is helpful? Okay. So let's look here at one more site. The reason I wanted to show you this site is because this week's assignment, it would be very helpful for you to use, I feel like, Bankrate. So Bankrate.com is a site that's been around for a long time. It's a free site because there's a lot of advertising on it. It's a really busy site. But if you go to mortgage calculators on this site, okay, when you get to this site, if you go to mortgage calculators, you're going to find a screen that looks just like the one that I have pulled up right now. And this screen will take care of everything that you need to do for this week's assignment. Okay, so you just plug in the numbers and you're able to get the information that you need for this week's assignment. As an aside, you could screenshot this screen so that I make sure that your inputs are correct for this week's assignment if you'd like to. And that could also be part of your work that you do this week. So it's bankrate.com. I don't know if you can see at the top of the screen the web address, Catherine. Maybe not. Okay. Sorry. So bankrate.com, and then you go to mortgages, the drop down, and you go to mortgage calculator. And then it brings up this screen right here. Okay. Bankrate, mortgages, mortgage calculators on the drop down, and then it brings you to this screen, and then you can just plug in the information. I think the website does give you, I think it does give you the, excuse me. So I think our site, the assignment instructions, sorry, just had a complete freeze of mind there. So the assignment instructions do give you a site. I think it's mortgage.com, and I think Bankrate, all I'm saying is I think Bankrate's an easier site to use in order to pull up the information that you need, okay? I'm sorry, Catherine. I should have just screenshotted the screen. I'm actually sharing a live web page with you, and that's probably why it's not coming through very clear. When I was on the slides that we're going to discuss tonight, those were probably clear, but these websites, sometimes when I go to a live website, doesn't come through very clearly. So as I mentioned, bankrate.com. So that's bankrate.com. Then you go to the mortgages tab, and then you go to the mortgage calculator to put in information, and then you calculate, and you just hit calculate, and you can find all the information you need for this week's assignment. Okay? get back to a screen that works a little better. All right, so we want to talk a little bit about kind of the process of funding. So keep in mind that if you don't borrow money for a home, then you wouldn't need this process, okay? So this process only applies to a situation where you're actually borrowing money. And as I mentioned earlier, that's the majority of the time for most of us, right? Most of us can't afford to just take a bunch of cash, a pile of money that we've got hidden in our basement, and go out and buy a house. Houses are usually financed. And what we mean is people usually use borrowed funds in order to accomplish a home, the purchase of a home. So a promissory note is the first step. A promissory note is a contract between the borrower and the lender, and you've got the obligor and the obligee. Okay, the obligee is the person who's obligated to actually get the financing, and the obligor is the person who's obligated to go ahead and transfer the property if money comes. We've got the principal, which is the payment, and we've got an acceleration clause and a signature that are all required as part of a promissory note. And all of this is just the promise, okay, of an individual to make payments and to borrow money in order to get money. So a mortgage isn't created initially. All that's created initially is this promissory note between a bank, usually, or a lending institution and an individual. Okay, and so if I need money to buy a house, what I do is I go and I accomplish a promissory note with the bank. And basically that promissory note is going to say, I promise to make payments for such and such amount of time. And in order to do this, and in order to accomplish this promissory note, I pledge the collateral or the principal of my property that I'll be in, and I promise to transmit title to you as the lender, okay, as the bank. So you may wonder, why is a bank willing to give money before a seller's willing to transfer ownership? And the only reason they're willing to give money in order to let the transaction occur is because of this promissory note that gets created initially between a borrower and a lender. Okay, so here's how it works out. Initially, the buyer gives a note to the lender, right? The promissory note to the lender, and then in return for that promissory note, they get the money. Okay, usually they get the right to the money because the bank is usually going to wire that money directly to a title company, and the title company is going to send that money directly to the seller. Okay, so a lot of times the buyer's never even going to see the money. The title company is just going to be the one that facilitates this whole thing. But for the sake of reviewing the steps, initially the buyer is going to create a promissory note. This is where all the underwriting occurs, between you and the bank. The bank's going to assess whether or not they want to enter an agreement with you and give you the money, and they might say no, right? It's their right and prerogative to say no if they don't want to give you the money, if they don't feel like you're going to be a good borrower and fulfill your commitment. They can say no to this application for promissory note. But assuming that you are approved, then you give this promissory note and this accepted underwriting to the bank, and in return you get the right to some money, right, so that you can go and buy the house. Then you give that money obviously to the seller of the home, and in return the seller gives you the deed. Okay, and we talked about the deed and the purpose of a deed last week, right? The purpose of a deed is to transfer ownership. So you get the completed deed once you give the seller the money. Okay, like anything else, it's always good to get your money before you give property, right? Sometimes people will say, well, if you give me the money now, then I'll give you the property later. And I would encourage people to never transact that way, right? Wait until you've got money in hand and then immediately give the property at that time, or you run into some problems. So this process all happens very seamlessly and quick once we're to the point where we've got money from the bank approved. That's usually the part that takes the longest, is getting the money in hand from the bank. But then once we've got that, the deed is, once that deed is received, then the buyer has clear title, and usually the buyer is then obligated to give title to the lender, right? And the mortgage is basically the promise, once again, that assumes the promissory note associated with the title to the property and the collateral associated with that loan. Okay, so one of the things that most of us refer to incorrectly when we go to apply for a loan, we usually say, I went to go apply for a mortgage, and we're right because the end result is going to be a mortgage, but initially we're just creating a promissory note, right, between us and the bank. So that's step one, and that's a little bit of a misunderstanding that most of us have. We're not applying for a mortgage. Eventually we're going to get a mortgage because of this promissory note that's going to be created between ourselves and the bank, or ourselves and the lender. And then we've got to give money to the seller before the seller is going to give us deed. And once we have deed and we accept it, right, and it's a valid deed, then we have title, okay? And then we're going to transfer basically title to the institution that let us borrow money. And that mortgage contract's going to state that if we renege on our payments or become delinquent on our payments, that there's recourse for the bank to take back that property in order to satisfy the loan, okay? That's where that writing is in the mortgage, okay, that we talked about earlier tonight. All right, so the mortgage instrument, separate agreement from the note, right? Separate agreement from the promissory note. It's the thing that provides the collateral, in this case the home or property, to the lender to back up the promise made in the note. Okay, so that's what the mortgage instrument is. Gives us an example. This is in the text, right, in the ebook. Oh, and by the way, I think this is chapter 9, but you could check the readings. And also under readings and tools, you've got every week's slides. If you ever have any questions, about anything that we discuss in the slides, they're part of the readings and tools every week under the pages, for each week. In addition to that, obviously we, even if you do attend the live session, you can always get the recorded session each week. Each week after the live session, I end up posting it. Usually takes a few hours though for that to happen. Catherine, is this screen pixelated and blurry as well? I'm just curious. I didn't know if these slides would be the same way as the websites, or is this? I mean, I know it's small on this page. I know this is a small slide, but I just wonder if it's also okay. That's good to know, because in the future, I can screenshot those pages of the websites instead of going to the live page themselves, and I think that'll help it be a little bit clearer when we're reviewing those. So, okay, so you can see some basic needs of a promissory note secured by mortgage. So this is a promissory note. It's got the basic information. It's got the location, right? It's got who is issuing the money, the mortgage company, and it's just what it says. It's a promissory note. So for fair value received, in this case, the money, I promise to pay the mortgage company, right? The sum, the monthly sum, starting at such and such date, every month, with an interest rate associated with it until maturity of that loan term. So note can be prepaid, right? So I can pay it off early if I'd like to. Usually we'll institute some kind of grace period on the monthly payment. But then if the payments aren't made, so should default of payments happen, so this last line here, should defaults be made in payments, any installments when due, the entire principal and accrued interest shall immediately become due. And then the situation is that once all of it's immediately due, if it's not satisfied, which it rarely is, that's where they go to the mortgage, which allows them the right to foreclose on the property. Okay, so this is something that we promise when we get money from the bank. Okay, so it shouldn't be any surprise to us that if we stop making payments, that the bank is going to foreclose on our house, because it's written very clearly into the verbiage of the documents that we sign when we take these loans. Okay, and once again, that's the way that the bank protects themselves to get their money back that they let us borrow. Then we've got the mortgage. This is just a long way, a legal way, a long legal way, and most of them are even longer than this now, if you can imagine. But here are the basics that need to be there. But the bottom line is that the promissory note is backed by this document, which allows the home to be retaken or reassumed, and it allows for it to be sold or disposed of in order for the bank to recover the money that's due on the promissory note. Okay, that's why the mortgage is there. Now, as part of a mortgage, there's usually a list of what we refer to as covenants, and you'll recognize covenants, the term covenants, from the deed, right? There's a covenant and warranty deed, and that just included some extra promises, right? So that's what a covenant means. When it comes to mortgages, we have some different covenants that we make that the bank requires us to make, okay? So these aren't optional. These aren't optional promises associated with a mortgage. These are all required, and you'll understand why here in a second on each one of them. So for example, when we enter a mortgage, we promise to pay our taxes, okay? And specifically, we're talking about property taxes here. So can Andrea, can you or Catherine think why a mortgage company is making us promise to pay our taxes? Why would they be so interested in making sure that we pay our taxes? Other than it's just a good thing to do, right? But why else would they be so interested in having us do that? Any thoughts? It's not just because they're mean. That's okay. It took the reason that that's the case is because if the bank, if you don't pay your taxes, if you don't pay your property taxes, then technically the county, whoever assesses your taxes, has first right to the property value, and they can lien against the property value and become first lien holder above and more important than the bank. Okay, so the bank is highly interested in you making sure and paying your property taxes, because if you don't, the county can take your taxes out of your home and foreclose on your home because you defaulted on your taxes. Okay, so in a situation where you own the house free and clear and don't have any debt, if you were to stop paying taxes, the government would actually take away your home in order to satisfy your property taxes, okay, which are required of any homeowner, which sounds crazy, but that's what happens. So mortgage companies are highly interested and anxious for you to pay your taxes, because if you don't, that allows the government to come in and take their asset, right? They look at your home as their asset when they have a loan with you, and they don't want the government to come in and take it away from them, obviously. So you're promising, when you take out a mortgage, to pay your taxes. If you become delinquent on your taxes, the mortgage, technically, the mortgage becomes null and void, and they're able to assess the entire value of the loan immediately and come after your home. Okay, and it's basically a race to the bottom, right? So if a mortgage company sees that you're defaulting on your tax payments or not current on your tax payments, they're going to hurry and try to either force you to pay your taxes or encourage you to pay them, or default or foreclose on the house so they can recover their money before the government comes after you. Because when it comes down to it, a fight between banks and the government's always going to win, right? So the idea is the banks are highly interested in making sure you promise to pay your taxes. Now, does that mean that everybody pays their taxes? Of course it doesn't. It's just something that you're covenanting to or promising when you take out a mortgage. And it's because we need to protect the interest of the bank by making sure our taxes are paid, so the government doesn't get involved and try to take away their asset, what they consider their asset. We covenant against removal. So what this means is that the fixtures associated with the real estate, we talked about fixtures in week 1, anything that's a fixture of the real estate. So, if you're bought a home, this would be the home, right? The home itself. We are promising to not remove those fixtures, okay? So whatever they're underwriting the loan on, obviously they want that asset to stay there. If they underwrite a loan on a house and then you tear down the house, or you try to move it somewhere else, rip it off its foundation and try to move it somewhere else, that's in violation of the promise that you made when you took the loan. Now, as soon as you've completed out the mortgage, right, and paid off the loan, you can do whatever you want, right? But until you've paid off the loan, you've promised not to remove anything from the property that's a fixture of the property. This isn't personal property. You can do whatever you want with your personal property. But as far as fixtures of the home, things that are connected and part of the home, you're promising that you won't remove those when you're in when you have a mortgage. You promise to have insurance, and specifically this is insurance. This is homeowners insurance. It's not health insurance. It's not car insurance. It's homeowners insurance. And homeowners insurance will protect against fire damage and against other kinds of damage that can happen to a home. And so once again, this makes sense. This is the bank protecting the asset that they need to have protected just in case they have to take it back in order to protect their investment, right, their loan. And so that's why they require us to have homeowners insurance in order to get a mortgage. Now, once again, if we default on homeowners insurance or no longer carry it, the lender, the bank, can claim that we're in breach of contract and can once again declare the entire note due, which most of us aren't going to be able to satisfy an entire note, that's due all at once. And so then that gives them right to come after the home and take it away from us and sell the property in order to have somebody that will fulfill the covenants and promises in that house, or as far as customers are concerned, have somebody that will, fulfill those promises. We covenant even, and this might be something news. This might be news to people with mortgages. We covenant to keep the home in good repair and to preserve and maintain the property. Okay, so if a bank were to see that you have not been keeping the home in good repair, you're not doing just basic maintenance, you once again would be in breach of contract, and they technically could make the note completely due, and unless you could satisfy the note, they could foreclose on your house. Now, that sounds pretty dramatic, and I have not ever experienced a situation where a bank has done that, but you can understand why they would put that into the contract. And the reason is if you have a leak in your house, right? Let's say your roof has a leak, and instead of repairing it, you just think, well, I don't care. I'm not going to worry about it. So what happens if we have a rainstorm like we've had the last couple of days in Utah, and you have a little leak in your roof and you haven't repaired it? You're going to create all kinds of damage, right, Andrea, Catherine? If you don't repair those leaks and maintain your property, you could create thousands and thousands and thousands of water damage, right, dollars in water damage, if you don't just try to maintain it. Now, it doesn't mean you have to put a new roof on, right? They don't require you to have a new roof. But it does require, that you just do the basic maintenance and keep up with basic maintenance so that the property value doesn't tank because you were neglectful. Another example would be, let's say that you're off to the store and you don't really care if your door stays open, so you just leave the front door open. And animals come in and make their nests in your house, and all kinds of things like that. If you let animals into your house, right, that's neglectful. And it can reduce the property value significantly, right? And so if I'm a bank and I see that you're doing that, or I find out that you're doing that, I'm going to say, hey, you're in breach of our agreement. You're not fulfilling your end of the bargain. I gave you money, right? And you promised me that you would maintain the property and not be neglectful. And that's not what you're doing. So that's why that good repair and preservation and maintenance, those different covenants exist as well. It's to protect, once again, the bank from losing their investment. Because if you trash the home and then walk away from it without paying off the note, and then the bank ends up with a trashed property, they're not going to be able to recover their investment, right? They're going to lose a bunch of money on that investment. So, like I say, most of these covenants are so that the bank can protect their investment, that loan that they've given to you. Okay, so let's look real quick at the basic order before we get to the test and review the information that you'll need to know for the test. The basic order of debt priorities, which all this means is who comes first when it comes to a loan, to the asset of a home. And as you would expect, some people have like first mortgages or senior mortgages, and then they have like a second loan, second mortgage. Second mortgages were more common, 5-6 years ago in the height of the real estate boom. A lot of people would get second mortgages or lines of credit. Lines of credit are still pretty common at this point, but second mortgages aren't as common. And the reason they're not as common is because so many banks lost their money when it came to these second mortgages. Because what happens is if a home goes into foreclosure, the first mortgage holder or the main mortgage, that bank is going to collect. And if you collect more than what's owed that bank, then the second mortgage or the line of credit holder will then get paid. But what happened in 2009, 10, 11 is that these homes were worth less, a lot less than what they were bought for. And so folks that defaulted on their loans most of the time created a situation where that second mortgage or that line of credit didn't get satisfied from the sale of the property. The first mortgage holder barely got their money, let alone anybody else. And so second mortgage, junior mortgages, lines of credit, those folks a lot of times didn't get anything, after the foreclosure process. And so lost a lot of money. Banks lost a lot of money on those second mortgages and lines of credit. And it created a situation where it makes them a lot harder to get nowadays. Now, what is subordination? Subordination is when a first mortgage holder subordinates their right, their priority to first right at the home to a second lien holder, like a second mortgage or line of credit. And this is pretty rare, but every once in a while there's a circumstance or situation where a bank, it's in their best interest to subordinate to a second mortgage or in trade for something else of value, obviously, for a property. Now, if a bank's fairly certain that a second mortgage holder is in position to collect on a debt better than they are, let's say it's an out-of-state bank and they don't have the resources in that state to foreclose and to go through that process, they might subordinate only to allow the other bank just to basically go through the process for them. And in the end, if they think that they're still going to get paid, it's no sweat off their back, right? But it's pretty rare to subordinate alone because most first position banks aren't willing to subordinate their right to first position, as you can imagine. Okay. Chattel liens just has to do with personal property, liens against personal property, which is very rare. And then a foreclosure or power of sale, as we've talked about or alluded to. The foreclosure process is a situation that gets created when there's significant default on payments. Usually it's 90 days or longer, so 3 months worth of payments that haven't been paid. And many times over the past 5 or 6 years, it was even longer than that. They'd be in a situation where they'd go 6 months without a payment before the foreclosure process even started. Which you think about that, and most times when you have a loan and you go even a month without paying, there's usually recourse. There's usually, all kinds of things that start to happen right at 30 or 60 days. With mortgages, that process got pretty slow because legally it's pretty hard for banks to foreclose. And even though it's hard, though, they're willing to jump through those hoops and go through that process, even if it takes them a lot of time to make sure and get their money back. This is probably too small for anybody to see here. Sorry, screen sharing is closed for some reason. So hopefully you can see this overview of mortgage foreclosure. It's in the e-text, so you can look at it later because this is probably too small as we're looking at it together here. But basically, it's a diagram of how the foreclosure process gets executed on. So there are different ways, different methods of foreclosure that banks can use. And this just goes through the basics of that. Most foreclosures end up going into a situation where it's a power of sale circumstance where they're publicly auctioned. And so what happens is there's this process, this is lengthy process of notification, of public notification where it has to be published in the paper. I don't know if any of you read a newspaper anymore, but if you do, even if you read it electronically, you'll notice all these notices, these public notices. A lot of times they're estate situations where the government's having to publicly notice, put public notice on an estate that they're putting through probate for estate planning purposes, but many of them are foreclosures. And so it's a property that either the government or a bank is foreclosing on, and so they have to give public notice in a public place, like a newspaper. It's one of the requirements before they can proceed with the process. Okay? And that just gives anybody who's interested, any interested parties, fair warning, right? So they get letters, they get notifications on their house usually, But if it's a property maybe that you own and you've changed, homes a bunch of times, and your address is different, and you don't even live there, and you're not even live in the vicinity of that area, that's where these public notices come into play, because this is basically the government saying, hey, if you think if you're defaulting on your home, this is a way that you can check where the process is in foreclosure if you're not getting any of the notifications, which would be crazy because the banks are highly communicative. They send a lot of information if you're going through this process to you. But if not, you'd notice it, in a public place like a paper. Now, I think the government's going to have to relook at that, because nowadays so many people don't even look at newspapers. Back in the day, everybody read newspapers, right? But now, very few of us take the paper, and so they might have to look at this process and reevaluate that requirement, since people don't do that anymore. Okay, so that's all that we wanted to cover tonight. Before we wrap up slides and get to what's on the test, any questions or concerns about the material? Any comments? Hopefully you learned a couple new things tonight. Usually I find, this is one of those sessions where people find some information maybe that they didn't know before. So hopefully there's a few things that you've picked up on tonight and can take with you. But any questions before we go? Okay, good. Good to hear, Catherine. Okay, so real quick, as far as last week's test, as far as the assignment, as far as the discussion board from last week or any of the weeks, any questions or concerns about anything we've done to this point in the class that I could help you with before we proceed? So grading, just as a heads up, tonight I'll probably finish grading from last week, either tonight or tomorrow morning. Like we talked about before, usually Tuesday by noon, we've got everything completed as far as all the grading. So I should get to discussion boards and assignments this evening and tomorrow morning. So look for grades from last week if your work was turned in on time. And very good to hear, Catherine. Thanks for getting caught up. Appreciate that. And so, yeah, even late work, I'll try to get caught up on everything tonight, tomorrow morning, and you should know right where you're at. Now, just to reiterate something we talked about in week 1, that is that I do allow for late work, as we've alluded to, and even though we're now to the point where we're halfway through the course, with 2 weeks left in the course, you've still got plenty of time if you plan your time wisely and schedule your time wisely. Manage your time wisely, I should say, to complete the course, even if you find yourself quite a ways behind. So this is the point in the class where I usually always will encourage people not to give up and not to become discouraged by how much work they have to do, because you've still got a couple weeks. You can still pass the class no matter where you're at. So I just encourage you to take wherever you're at and do your best and still put in some effort at this point and get everything in so that you can pass. Okay, let's look at this week's test real quick. This week's test is 50 points again. Last week's was 100. This week's is only 50, and not a lot of questions, only 5 questions again. So each of the questions is worth 10 points. So once again, not going to be a long test, but please be careful on it, because if you miss a few, you're not going to like the grade that you get, right? So we want you to get either all of them right, or maybe you just miss one, so that you get a good grade on this test. And so be careful about the questions. Read them, reread them, read all the answers a couple times so you feel very comfortable with how you're answering them. And if you take a few notes tonight, from the session, I think you'll be in great shape. So number 1 on the test has to do with what happens, or what surplus money action is. So this has to do with the process of foreclosure between senior and junior mortgage holders. And you'll want to see what the book has to say about surplus money action. Okay, what is surplus money action? Who files it? Why is it filed? Just make sure you understand the basics of surplus money action, and you'll get number 1 right on the test. Okay, so you'll have to go to the reading and make sure you've got that down. You'll want to make sure that you understand what a defeasance clause is. What is a defeasance clause? So this is part of a mortgage. Okay, You'll learn about it from the e-text, but what is a defeasance clause? We actually, there's a defeasance clause in the example we looked at, but I don't know that it called it that. So you'll want to go to the book and make sure you understand from the e-text what a defeasance clause is before you get to the test. You'll also want to make sure you understand the difference between a deed of trust. Okay, what is a deed of trust? And then what is a traditional mortgage? Is there a difference, or are they the same? What are the similarities? What are the differences between a deed of trust and a traditional mortgage before you get to the test? Number 4 on the test, you want to understand which one of the foreclosure processes, which one of those foreclosure processes requires a public sale. Okay, we talked about it briefly tonight, but you'll want to make sure and review and make sure in your notes you've got down which one of those foreclosure processes requires a public sale, okay, a public auction or public sale. And number 5 on the test, you want to make sure you understand what a lien theory state is. What is a lien theory state, and what does that mean? Okay, what is a lien theory state? What is the difference between a mortgage in a lien theory state and a non-lien theory state? Okay, if you understand that difference or find that in the book, the difference between a mortgage in a lien theory state, that's L-I-E-N, so a lien as in we lien something to get the asset value out of it. L-I-E-N, a lien theory state. What's the difference between a mortgage in a lien theory state and one that's not a lien theory state? Okay, and if you've got that in your notes before you get to the test, you'll get that one right on the test. So any questions about just 5 questions, just 5 things to go take notes on before you get to the test? Should be pretty straightforward, although it is material you're going to have to research out a little bit, and study up a little bit, hopefully, before you get to the test to make the test pretty straightforward and pretty easy this week. So any questions or concerns on that before we wrap up tonight? Okay. Thanks, Andrea, for being part of the session. Have a great night. Good luck this week. Let me know if you've got any questions or concerns, and we'll help you out. Have a good one.